Soviet Union was not prepared for war. Its war industry was incipient, and it did not have the capacity to produce in large quantities. His army lacked adequate preparation for a conflict of great proportions, and many of the best generals had fallen victim to Stalin's purges between 1936 and 1938. With this gloomy outlook, they were forced to invade by an excellently trained, well-equipped German army with combat experience. Of course, the Soviets had two powerful allies: the immense and almost endless Russian steppes and the best of its commanders, the Winter General. However, this was not enough to counter the Wehrmacht's onslaught, and the Soviet Union, barring a miracle, was not able to defeat the Germans on its own. But the miracle came, and with its own name, the Lend-Lease Act. But what did this law consist of? It was basically a program under which the United States began to supply food, oil, and military equipment to various countries, especially the United Kingdom and the Soviet Union. This program ran from March 1941 to August 1945. The supplies included warships, fighter jets, and other weapons. The aid was completely free, although some ships were returned after the end of the war. In total, the United States sent supplies worth $50.1 billion at the time, equivalent to $1.262 trillion today. $1,262 million in the long scale used in Europe and Latin America. Initially, the bulk of the support went to Great Britain, to whom it supplied dozens of destroyers, millions of liters of fuel, and thousands of tons of supplies, so that it could prevent the invasion of the islands. At the beginning of Operation Barbarossa, the German invasion of the Soviet Union in June 1941, the center of gravity of the war in Europe shifted eastwards. From July of that year, it became clear that the Russians had no capacity to contain the German advance, which clearly indicated that without American support, the Soviet Union would be defeated. Hence, President Roosevelt's decision was to start sending all kinds of elements, among which the following stood out: 15,000 aircraft, 12,000 armored vehicles, 7,000 tanks, 400,000 trucks and jeeps, 35,000 motorcycles, 700 artillery tractors, 800,000 tires, 2,000 locomotives, 12,000 railway cars, 540,000 tons of steel rails, 8,300 anti-aircraft guns, 2 million of rifles, 100,000 machine guns, 340,000 tons of explosives, 1 million kilometers of telephone wire, 18 million tons of food, 49,000 tons of leather and fabrics, 15 million of pairs of boots too, 700,000 tons of oil, and 842,000 tons of various chemicals. These gigantic figures show that American aid was decisive for Russia not to lose the war. In order to bring the delivery of materials and equipment to a successful conclusion, 3 main routes were used. The Arctic route that was the shortest and most direct, but also the most dangerous, since it necessarily forced them to move close to the coasts of Norway, which was occupied by the Germans. It also involved sailing through seas plagued by icebergs. 4 million tons were shipped along this route. The Persian corridor was the longest route and was not fully operational until mid-1942. From then on, it saw the passage 4,200,000 tons of goods. And finally, the Pacific route that began operating in August 1941, but was affected by the beginning of hostilities between Japan and the United States. After December 1941, only Soviet ships could be used. 8,300,000 tons of goods passed through this route. The only restrictions imposed by the United States were limited to the supply of heavy bombers. The Soviet Union had requested the support of 240 B-17 bombers and 300 B-24 bombers, but the Americans needed these long-range heavy bombers for their operations in the Pacific and operations over the skies of the heart of Germany. Another component of the aid was that factories in the United States were dismantled, which were taken in pieces to the Soviet Union, where they were put together again and began to produce. In these factories reinstalled on Soviet soil, American instructors, foremen, and workers worked. On the other hand, the United States sent raw materials and the money to pay British workers, which built and later sent to the Soviet Union thousands of planes, tanks, and guns. But this is not just the assessment of any analyst. Let us reproduce the words of Nikita Khrushchev, leader of the Soviet Union between 1953 and 1964. I would like to express what I discussed with Stalin on more than one occasion about whether the Red Army and the Soviet Union could not have stood up to Nazi Germany and survived the war without the help of the United States and Britain. In his own words, he told me that if the United States had not helped us, we would not have won the war. If we had fought Germany one-on-one, we could not have withstood the pressure. When I heard his comments, I completely agreed with him. And today I'm even more so. The United States definitely saved the Soviet Union. The makers of this video say Histori